The Athletic.
The race is on, and Charles Leclerc's return to winning ways at Monaco, combined with the front of F1 getting very competitive lately, means it's not out of the question he could be a title contender. But has he proved himself ready? And how would he fare against Max Verstappen in a straight fight? I'm Edd Straw, and joining me to discuss all things Leclerc are Ben Andersonn and Josh Suttill. Well, Ben, welcome back to the podcast. We haven't had you on for a few episodes. I guess you'll have enjoyed Charles Leclerc's win. So, a fun topic to delve into.
Yeah, I've been away for the past week, visiting my family in Portugal. So I was following the events of Monaco from afar, and not as closely as you guys were. Finally, he's broken the hoodoo, the home race hoodoo.
Exactly, and Josh, obviously you were there for Monaco for that particularly iconic moment. So you're all over what was going on that weekend. So I guess it's nice to have got you. We briefly talked about this, but now the Monaco experience has settled in your mind. How big a deal is it? I asked that partly because there's been this social media debate, hasn't there, about it's great for people who are there, terrible for people who are watching at home.
How expensive was your most expensive pizza? That's the main question.
Well, I did see one for about €27, which I didn't go, and it was only a margarita as well.
Did it have truffle oil on it?
No, just a plain old margarita. Man. Give me an Asda one any time, but obviously other supermarkets are available.
You couldn't find the local Asda in Monaco.
No, surprisingly, no. They don't seem to have budget shops.
It's tough,
there.
Isn't it? It's tough.
It is, but no, yeah, it was a great experience and a wonderful event on site. I can definitely sympathise with the view that it's better when you're there because, to be honest, it is. You can't hide from that, quite simply. But also we stayed in Nice and commuted in, and actually that is definitely a more affordable way of doing it. So even though it does seem a very, very expensive and kind of on the shelf thing that most people wouldn't be able to do, if you're able to sort of do it in a certain way, then it's not as bad. Any F1 race is going to be expensive, but I think compared to some others, it's actually not too bad.
Montreal is the one I'm going to throw in there. The hotel prices in Montreal are absolutely insane. Just preposterous, the costs there. But anyway, that's just a little personal gripe of mine. But yeah, did you go to the vastly overrated Tip Top bar, Josh?
No. I didn't consume anything that was you had to pay for in Monaco. It was the lovely free food provided by the circuit and anything we could bring in or have back in Nice.
Hang on, lovely free food. Have they upgraded from the butterless ham and cheese sandwiches of 10 years ago?
the ones there aren't quite enough of.
Yes, never. Yeah, they've all gone before you even arrived.
There was a vegetable sandwich, which I must admit I've never had, and that was actually quite nice. Bit of aubergine.
Could you work out what the vegetables were?
I find it
or
better
was it just
to
nondescript vegetables?
Close your eyes and have a bite.
Always a dangerous motto in life, but Monaco's a fun experience. I must say, it's a race. I love the bit when they're on the track. But a lot of the other stuff at Monaco is not really very me. It'll come as no surprise to learn. But anyway, it's great to have ticked off your first Monaco. Obviously, Ben, you've been many times in the past as well. So let's get into our talking point today. And Ben, we'll set aside the question of car performance versus Red Bull for now and just look at Leclerc himself. If this year were to turn into a title push for him, which isn't impossible given he's 31 points behind, although you'd still have to say Max Verstappen and Red Bull are still clear favourites to win, probably with races to spare.
Caveat.
Exactly. But in this hypothetical world where Leclerc is on equal terms, how do you think he would fare with where he is as a driver?
Well, yeah, I think he's just about there, isn't he? If you're tiering the current drivers in Formula One, he's in the top tier as far as I can see. He's quick enough. He's experienced enough. He knows how to win races. We're setting aside the question of car performance, but that's really the limiting factor. If he's not car limited, I can see him giving it a really good go. The only thing is that he lacks the experience of being in the title fight, which Verstappen has. Verstappen's battle hardened from the 2021 season that we don't talk about the ending of, and obviously has, built this kind of Red Bull juggernaut around himself to a certain extent. I think Leclerc's in that process as well with Ferrari. Vasseur being in there, we'll obviously get to this, has been good for him. But in terms of his skill set, I don't think he's quite as ruthless as Max. So maybe if it came down to kind of, one key moment, a kind of Adelaide 94 or Jerez 97 type, flashpoint, would he come off on the right end of having to get it done? I feel like he's been through F1 a slight step behind Max in terms of pushing the edge of, or pushing the envelope of, racing and how to get work in the grey areas of the racing rules. But he adapts quickly and has done. The battles he's had on track years ago with Max, he got bullied out of a race win in Austria, but then got his own back at Silverstone. So I don't, apart from the difference in experience, I don't think there's a huge amount to choose between them. Very nitpicking stuff. I think Leclerc is just waiting for his opportunity. Whether it comes this year or not will ultimately depend on the development race and whether Red Bull keep tripping up over themselves.
And over one lap as well, you bet on Leclerc, I'd say, and Verstappen's a great qualifier as well, but Leclerc for me is probably the best qualifier in F1 at the moment. He's so good over one lap, and even to the point where when he's having a bit of a struggle over one lap this year, and that was a huge thing because he's usually so good over one lap and had those problems but was able to work through them and has just shown a great turn of speed ever since his junior category days.
They don't last long, do they? When he has a mini slump, it really is a mini slump.
Yeah.
It's like it's one or two sessions. Even, Miami, where he messed up in FP1, you think, he's going to be massively on the back foot now because it's a sprint weekend. But actually, the rest of the weekend, he was right there. So even though he's been mistake prone, maybe in the past, I think those mistakes, they still happen because he's pushing to the edge, but they don't happen as frequently, and they don't tend to linger in terms of what he does next.
He's also this season been very consistent because even though he had a few difficult weekends early on, and I don't include Bahrain in that because he'd have beaten Sainz in Bahrain but for having a problem in the race, but he's been in the top four every single race, including those two sprints we've had. So one of the reasons he is close to Verstappen in the championship, relatively close to Verstappen in the championship, but still more than a race win's worth, is because he has been picking up consistent points in the top four every time. In fact, he was consistent at the back end of last season as well, because if you look back all the way really to Monza last year, Austin he was disqualified. Brazil, he had the crash on the way to the grid, but that was a hydraulic problem. So he's just been relentlessly picking up results. Even early on, it wasn't great, sort of fourth, fifth, that kind of thing, and then started picking up the podiums again at the end of the season. So he's been a very consistent performer of late, and I think that's quite important.
And Sainz has been a really tough teammate for him. Sainz has pushed him far more than any of Verstappen's recent teammates. I guess it's similar to when Verstappen had to go up against Ricciardo and it was a very even match, but ultimately it was Verstappen who was getting that edge over time. And with Leclerc and Sainz, I think even when obviously Sainz has got ahead, as we've said before, usually Leclerc is just able to work through those problems so well that the kind of end result is always going to be Leclerc coming out on top in that team. And he's been properly pushed ever since Sainz was his teammate in 2021.
Yeah, probably the only race you'd say is he let get away from him this year definitely is Melbourne. The one time when Red Bull were completely unreliable and Max was out of the picture, it was Sainz picking up the pieces and it should be Leclerc ordinarily. Obviously, there's going to be weekends where Sainz is ahead. I think, Ed, you calculated it's normally 2/3 to a third, isn't it, over the whole life of their careers together in Ferrari? Yeah,
all those metrics, if you look at it, they basically sit between, I think, 60 and 68% when I last looked at it a few days ago. And Sainz is there, but it tends to be when the car gets a little bit more front limited, you've got to be, it's understeery. I mean, there were times last season where the rear was so unstable they had to dial in understeer, and Leclerc struggled. And I think Sainz is quicker with a car in that condition than Leclerc is, whereas actually I think that's more extreme even than what we see with Verstappen and Perez, because I think normally if that car gets a bit front limited, Perez gets to a similar-ish pace to Verstappen, but never without an assist leaps ahead of him, whereas actually that's the condition where Sainz is quicker than Leclerc. But give Leclerc the car balance he wants, which is a car balance you'll generally have a lot of the time without too much understeer, and he's usually the quicker, but not always, and Sainz is close.
Yeah, you could say in Red Bull, Perez was that at the start of 2023, and then Max obviously made a bit of a breakthrough personally in that Baku race where he was behind, and now he seems to be better. in the understeering car than he was. I think maybe Sainz is potentially better than Perez even in that. So there's a slight offset maybe between the teammates too. So, and ultimately you see in both cases when the car starts off a little bit under the limit, maybe biased that way because they haven't quite sorted it, or they've got, developments in the pipeline to rebalance it to make it faster. Those drivers are closer to their teammates. We've seen it Red Bull at the start of this year. We've seen it definitely with Sainz. And then once the development starts to kick in, you just see those two, Verstappen and Leclerc, assert their authority a bit more and a bit more consistently. It's the same kind of phenomenon you saw with Lewis Hamilton and Valtteri Bottas at Mercedes when, remember when they were winning everything. Bottas would often be quite relatively better off at the start of a season, would nick the odd race win, qualify quite close, but then once the car development kicked in and the car got edgier to drive and quicker, Hamilton just increasingly blew him away.
And we sometimes saw that with the closer title fights as well. Look at 21 where, Bottas was just blown out of the water by what Hamilton was able to find that extra level. Leclerc feels like, to me, the kind of driver who could do that in a title fight as well. Some of the...
Yeah.
Well, but and obviously on the other hand, you look at a year like 2020 when that Ferrari was pretty terrible and Leclerc was so far ahead of what Vettel was able to do with that car. So he's really good in both those kind of less good years and the better years. And obviously Sainz has taken the bigger opportunities, hasn't he? Because he took the win in Singapore last year. Like I say, he took the Melbourne win. He was riding high at Monza as well. So it's one of those things, isn't it? Is that a coincidence that Sainz just happens to be the one who was on form at that particular time? Or is there an element there of some of the bigger occasions slipping away from Leclerc? Obviously until last weekend where he was the one who took advantage of Ferrari's car advantage.
I think it's a little bit what we mentioned about the street circuit limitation. You're always gonna have a front limitation there necessarily in the setup because you can't afford to have too edgy a car around a street circuit, and you need an understeer balance to get the traction. So that plays to Sainz, I think, and it happens to be those races where also Red Bull, because of this inherent problem that Max has been discussing about the ride, now it's closed up more generally in other types of corners, they're relatively worse off. So there's a little bit of happenstance, I think, in terms of perfect circumstances. But more generally, I don't think Leclerc's really had a kind of weak season. If you take his whole career, he smashed Vettel for a couple of years. He's been car limited, I think, most of the time he's been at Ferrari. I think he's showing probably the maturity now to be less frustrated by that, and he trusts in Vasseur and the new broom in Ferrari management to kind of get that whole thing under control. And I think that's the key thing for Leclerc now. We're no longer talking about this amazingly fast driver who's just being contained by a completely haphazard, wasteful team. That whole narrative has completely kind of died away. Now it's more a case of Ferrari they seem to be building something, and Leclerc seems to be fully committed because he trusts that when that all comes together, and I'm sure in his mind it is a case of when and not if, then he'll be absolutely ready because he's got all the necessary driving ingredients. It's just what's around him that's so far let him down, I think.
I think the main question for him will be, if it's a title fight, it's a lot of races, you need to make sure you're making the most of every single weekend. Verstappen generally is very good at that. I'll actually argue that Monaco was a rare occasion when Verstappen didn't, because had he not, and it was a mistake, the car was a bit all over the place, but he could have been second or third on the grid and then he'd been on the podium. So that was a sixth place that could have been a P2, P3. Certainly.
And also that overplays the Red Bull rubbish at street circuits narrative a bit too, doesn't it? Because although he's saying, we've got this issue that makes us less performant, he also wasn't as far off as he looked because of that qualifying mistake.
Exactly, yeah. So Verstappen generally is very, very consistently good. And in a title fight, sometimes you can't afford to have those few weekends where things do get away from you. Now, I would say Leclerc's done well this year in that even on the weekends where things haven't been going great, he's still come away with solid points and solid results, which is always important. But that would be my big question with him in terms of his technical contribution, etc. And actually, I'm interested to see how it pans out with his new race engineer, Brian Botzi, who obviously, you could very easily say, look, there's been the change and then he's won at Monaco, so brilliant. But that's not a big enough data set. What I will say is that although he was quick to say there were no real communication problems with his previous race engineer, the comms at Monaco seemed to be quite strong and clear as well in terms of the way the race played out. So I do wonder if there's a gain that's being made there, and perhaps that's something that will also help Leclerc. But we won't really know because we need a far, far bigger sample set of race weekends to judge that.
I think there's no way Ferrari made that change without thinking that obviously there could be a communication gain, because it was such a long relationship and a well kind of built up one, that I don't think you kind of end that unless you think that there can be a real benefit there.
There could also be an element of Leclerc needing that extra clarity, because I've wondered in the past if, we talked about how fast he is over a lap and how close he maybe drives to the limit of himself at all times. He's never struck me as an Alonso type who's kind of reading the whole race while it's going on around him, and that he's driving at sort of 85 or 90%. I always feel like Leclerc's pushing harder than that and is more passive, therefore, when it comes to kind of key strategic moments. Obviously, he's raged when Ferrari have got something wrong in Monaco pit stop in 2022, but it's kind of as it's happening, whereas Sainz has appeared to have a small edge in terms of just being able to take that step back and read the race for the team and therefore call the strategy as he wants. It might also be a bit of personality at play too, but I kind of feel like Leclerc inherently is a more passive character in that sense. He's kind of like, I'm doing this part of the job really, really well. Maybe also has a limit mentally because of how fast and well he is driving, and he needs that engineering team to handle a bit more of the load in terms of making those calls and everyone's going to benefit from clear communication, right? But if it's more critical to you because you can't make your mind up for yourself, then you're going to see a benefit from that extra, I think.
I think what he is really good at is when he's given clear instructions and a clear plan. So in Suzuka, when he did that one stop and executed that really well, he's really good at getting his head down and just executing the laps. I think there was a little mistake there, but that aside, he was just so good at putting in the lap, sticking to a lap time.
Yeah, relentless.
It's sort of a bit like Hamilton, because even though you'll often hear Hamilton questioning the strategy or thinking about things, a lot of the race, he's just got his head down and he's just delivering those extremely good laps and managing the tyres, which is obviously one of the biggest improvements Leclerc has made, like any rookie, because that was sometimes a problem for him earlier on in his career. But I think he's actually now one of the best at managing his rubber, and if there's a different one-stop strategy on Sunday, you can bet that someone like Leclerc can be one of the few to pull it off.
Yeah, he's done quite a few of those good sort of strategy drives over the years, often not to spectacular results, but ones that have made.
There was a great one in Turkey, wasn't there, against Vettel, where he absolutely destroyed Vettel over like a monster stint.
Yeah, there was a good Turkey one. There was a good Silverstone as well, which I think was 2020 when he did a one stop as well. So yeah, just he's always had that. And I actually see a few, if you look at it very low resolution, there's some similarities between the evolution of Leclerc that I think he's going through now and Hamilton, in that it took Hamilton a little bit of time to get more on top of being in control of how he thinks races were playing out, etc. And obviously when he's up against Button, because Button was very good at that. And it's difficult for a driver, because I think Leclerc has seen what Sainz can do, and I think he's pushed himself to try and do that. And obviously there's a certain element of that's in the way your mind works and what you can take in, etc. And I think he's probably realised that he can't have quite the same processing power in terms of the race situation as maybe Sainz generally has, which isn't a huge weakness, because, like I say, clear communication
Verstappen doesn't do that.
Exactly, yeah.
He just talks about what's happening in the moment to his car, doesn't he?
Exactly.
The tyres are no good, the balance is this or that. Obviously, he's normally at the front, so he doesn't really need to read the race so much. But you don't really hear Verstappen going, oh, so and so's in this position, and why aren't we doing this, and blah blah.
And ultimately, it's useful when a driver can do that, but it's not essential. Sainz is a very, very intelligent driver. He's very much thinks his way through the weekend, but Leclerc isn't an idiot, and it's small differences. And I hope the Ferrari change has helped that. But I think Leclerc will be, certainly through the experience he's had, he'll gradually be getting better in terms of understanding how to get the most out of a weekend. And it's that phrase that seems quite empty, but it's about being the best possible version of himself as a driver, rather than trying to be something else, because all drivers have different skill sets, and what Leclerc is spectacularly quick. He's got that good time management, he can execute good race stints, so any of the peripheral stuff is all stuff that the team really should be feeding into him.
And perhaps the difference will be, if you look at a season like 2022, obviously Ferrari didn't have a championship winning car by the end of it, but they did at the start, and Leclerc was very good in certain races there. But like you say, Ed, he was probably lacking a bit of that. Just take the best that you can from each weekend. There was a couple of mistakes and probably a little bit of too many errors creeping in there. So I was be interested to see if he's back in that position. How much of a change are we going to see from now to then? I think it'll be quite a lot based on the evidence of what he's been able to achieve over the past couple of years.
And also that understanding, that clear understanding of why you were fast or why you weren't on a given weekend. Like 2022, he smashed everyone at Melbourne and then seemed sort of surprised afterwards that he'd done it. He was like, I never go well around here. I don't like these kind of 90-degree corners in sequence, and somehow I'm just, smashing everybody and I'm miles down the road. It's like, you need to have a bit more grasp of that and where the weak points are. This is where I think Max is really good. He's always hammering the bad bits, even though they're winning so many races and having so many pole positions more often than not. I'm not sure Leclerc's always had that drive for the technical understanding to quite the same extent, but it does sound like in the intervening years and being paired alongside Sainz, who's really good at that, Leclerc is taking that on board and developing in that way. And then obviously in the bits where he's still deficient in his understanding, that's where Vasseur and others in Ferrari, in terms of leadership, need to build the right team around him so that overall they're functioning at their most efficient and most effective.
I think there's an element also of making sure you cut out the mistakes as well, which is a process that Verstappen had to go through. Pretty much every driver has to, but there have been a number of times when Leclerc has just hung it out a little bit too much in the race, because he's brilliant. Sometimes you see these spectacular qualifying laps from him where they don't look precise because he's right on the edge, but he can tiptoe that on that edge constantly. And there have been a few times in races. France a few years ago springs to mind. He had that accident at Parabolica at Monza in 2020, the one that caused the red flag, that was quite useful for Pierre Gasly among others. But
France was the last one though, wasn't it? I feel like that was the major turning point where he had he might not have beaten Max, but he had a chance of beating him, didn't do it, threw the car off, and he seemed to really ingest that one as kind of like, I've really thrown something away here, even though I think the car was difficult by then as well. I can't think of a race since where he's done something really stupid like in the race. Yeah,
there've been a few, weren't there? There were some errors in the first part of 23 as well, but
the car was awful, wasn't it?
The car was awful, yeah. But I think what I see in that France example was in that France situation, you're right. It wasn't like he threw away when he was leading, but Verstappen had already stopped and Leclerc was going to lose track position. And so he needed to go as quick as he possibly could in the final part of the stint. But the art is knowing what your 100% pace is, not just sort of saying, I've got to go really quickly and overstepping, which I think is what he did there. And I think gradually, with experience,
try and perform a miracle that you can't perform.
You've got to know what's 100%, not what's 101%. I think he's getting better at that, and still in a championship fight. I would like to see him tested, because I think that sort of thing can be exposed. But I say that about any driver who hasn't been in a proper title fight. We were talking about that about Verstappen, and I thought he'll probably be fine.
He would feel the pressure, definitely, like even Max did, even though he did a really good job of hiding it in 2021. He said subsequently, didn't he, that he was, and Red Bull could see it by the final race. He was tight. He wasn't the normal, relaxed, I just do my job Max. You just can't be when you're going through it for the first time, and Leclerc hasn't done that, and Max has. So if everything else is equal, just that simple fact will play to Max's advantage if it came down to a final race decider between the two of them.
Exactly, and I think that would be the big question mark for me, though. It's ensuring that consistency and the errors are minimised for Leclerc if he's battling against, say, Verstappen or certain other drivers as well, but he's certainly coming on. Right, well, Josh, let's talk about the Monaco victory. Do you think that carries special significance for Leclerc's development, or is it more just a personal milestone to be enjoyed that doesn't mean anything in the bigger picture? What's the narrative that's been created, and what's the reality?
There's definitely an emotional angle to it. Leclerc was tearing up going through the tunnel en route to victory, so it's undoubtedly, it's not.
Were you tearing up too, Josh?
it was great to see. It was proper sporting emotion. It's what you want to see. When I saw him in the press conference after, I was genuinely pleased for him, because how could you not be? It was a human being who was.
He wasn't crying at the extent of the pizza bill he'd have to be paying later when celebrating with his team.
No, exactly. But
it was one of the most popular wins, I think, just in terms of Leclerc getting that win at Monaco. I think very, very few people would begrudge him that. So it was one of those near universally welcomed victories. I think a good story.
Yeah, I mean, it almost closed a loop that had gone back to about 2017, during his F2 season, when he lost his father just before the Baku weekend and absolutely blew everybody away and had an incredible weekend, which should have been a double victory bar a yellow flag infringement. I think he put it on pole by over half a second. So it really did go all the way back to that, and I think he was thinking of his father and just was able to tick off this home victory that meant so much. And it didn't mean so much because everybody had been asking him or saying about the curse. It meant so much because it was a huge tick and a huge kind of nod to his father after all he'd done for him and after all the hard work that had gone into it. It was one of those truly emotional moments that I think is only going to be surpassed by the first title. Nothing beyond this is going to match that, apart from him winning his first title. So it's definitely important on the emotional thing, and is, I think, important to his development in a way, not because it's his first Monaco victory, but because it's his first victory for nearly 2 years. So it was good evidence of this approach that he's had this year. It was good evidence of what Ferrari's doing. It's only going to, I think, confirm that he's been right to stick with them. So yeah, the emotional significance is absolutely huge, but I do think there's also a little bit of development that's, I think, linked to that as well, that's going to help him going forwards.
I think the key element is that 2-year duck that he's broken. Yeah, winning your home race is obviously great. He's going to have a confidence boost from it. He's got, more points on the board from that weekend. I think Fred Vasseur talked about, it'll give him a boost. But it doesn't change his world. He's a Grand Prix winner already, like you say, until he wins that first title. Nothing's going to surpass it. But I think they've been growing this narrative, and we touched on it earlier, that when there was an opportunity for Ferrari to win a race, which hasn't been very often in the last few seasons, it's not been Leclerc taking that chance. It's been Sainz. And that's the fundamentally slightly lesser driver getting the job done in the key moments, and the supposedly better driver and the guy that Ferrari are backing long term not doing that. So for him to kind of nail that story, put it to bed by winning this race and getting off the mark properly with a win this year, I think that's more important. It's like, it's further evidence that, okay, it plays to his strength as a qualifier, but in terms of nailing that weekend, building through the sessions, getting the lap when you need it to get pole, not having something stupid go wrong, like the drive shaft being discovered broken on the way to the grid or something. It's all come together, but he's nailed the performance when it's mattered and taken a chance, which might be a rare chance. We'll see how it goes, obviously, but a rare chance to win a race for Ferrari. That's the most significant thing, I think. Yeah,
there were so many banana skins that could have tripped him up, and there was so much pressure behind him, because when you mark yourself out in practice as clearing away the favourite, the amount of pressure that goes through any driver is going to be immense. No more so than Monaco qualifying. So it was a great test, and it's those kind of weekends that if you can deliver, they're absolutely the backbone of a championship, because you have to come in as a favourite, you have to deal with the pressure, you have to get pole, you have to just tick these things off across the weekend, and that's exactly what he did. And it was really no different from what we've seen Verstappen do many times over the last couple of years.
He had to weather a little bit of difficulty in qualifying as well, in terms of it wasn't quite as straightforward as it might have been on his way to pole position. But I think that narrative became slightly misleading, because it would change a little bit as well. If you think back to Silverstone a couple of years ago, Leclerc was quicker than Sainz in the race, was ahead, would have won, but for the strategy situation. So these situational things help shape the narratives. And also, you've got that ratio of wins to pole positions, 24 pole positions he's got now, only 6 wins, and one of those wins didn't come from pole. But that reflects a performance profile of a Ferrari that he's often had, that's been a great qualifying car, and really not, very often he'd have a car that could take pole, but it wouldn't be the best car in the race. Sometimes it wouldn't even be the second best car in the race. So that is difficult. And I think, you've got to be a little bit careful about doing that, but at least going to Monaco, ticking that off is important. And I actually think that could be very useful next year. Let's say, hypothetically, he goes to Monaco in a championship fight. Not having the Monaco curse as a narrative is quite a useful thing, I think, for just to tick it off and get it out of the way when it's not quite so essential in the wider picture. Plays a part. Should we talk a little bit, Ben, about the Ferrari changes? We've alluded to it. Obviously, big changes there over the past 18 months since Fred Vasseur came in as team principal. Just how important is that change in terms of Leclerc's development and where he is in the team?
Yeah, I think that has been key in terms of solidifying Leclerc's place as the right bet for Ferrari, but also in his mind, Ferrari being the right team for him. Obviously, he's emotionally attached to Ferrari in quite an extreme way, and so you'd have to almost tear him out of that team. I think it'd have to have become an absolute unmitigated shambles for him to look to escape it. But you could sense before Vasseur came in that he was a bit concerned about how races were playing out. You mentioned Silverstone, the kind of strategic flat-footedness, and Mattia Binotto maybe not holding some elements of the team strongly enough to account, the consistently being let down and limited by the car performance, heroic qualifying efforts going unrewarded by race results. And it's taken some time, obviously. Vasseur had to pretty much work with what he had in 2023, but by the second half of the year, and particularly from Japan onwards, you could start to see real progress from some of the tweaks that have been made and the new focus that Vasseur's given them. And you can see that that's carried on into this year. And now, once again, Ferrari starts introducing updates, and Leclerc seems to take a step, and he seems to be becoming, more authoritative. And overall, I think he's just gained the confidence he expected to have from having a guy that he really rates and really trusts running the team, running it in a way that he knows will work for him, because Vasseur rates Leclerc and has been very important in terms of Leclerc's early development. It's, I guess, a similar rationale for Lewis deciding to ditch Merck and go there. Vasseur's a guy that's helped him way back, and I'm not saying that Lewis didn't trust Mercedes, but Vasseur is someone particularly who has such a strong reputation with drivers and knowing how to get the best from them and how they work and what they need. And so I think Leclerc's really taken a benefit from knowing that a guy like that, who he's seen the benefit from having the top job at the team, Leclerc was already building, but this is almost like a crucial kind of final piece in the trajectory for him, I think.
Yeah, I asked Charles about Fred after the race, and he said that he has no doubts about Vasseur having all the right pieces in place. And he says from the very first day that Fred joined, he's got everything he needed to bring the team back to where it belongs and means to a world championship. He's got such a clear vision of what he wants to achieve and how to achieve it. And I think that sums it up quite well. And he also says he doesn't lose time, and that is definitely a strength. And I think his vision is really good. So it's clearly that vision that Vasseur has that I think is really drawn Leclerc and, like you say, Hamilton to it. He's not focused on all these periphery things. He lets the driver just focus on the most important things, and what you see is what you get, kind of thing. So
he puts the driver at the centre as well. I think that's another thing. Ferrari's development over the winter was publicly touted as, last year's car was an evil thing to drive, so inconsistent. But actually, we've listened to the drivers and tried to put their feedback at the core of what we're doing in terms of the drivability. And Vasseur will be absolutely 100% pushing that. In the junior categories, where he's forged his reputation and built the reputations of many amazing drivers, it's all about that. If you're not focused on the driver's performance, you aren't going to succeed, because you haven't got many other levers to pull. And it's easy to lose sight of that in Formula One because it's such a big engineering game and there are so many more levers to pull. But teams are often guilty of treating the drivers as the famous analogy is like a light bulb. You just take one out, put another one in, and the car performance is the overriding thing. And it's not as clear cut as that. The performance can only be accessed by the driver getting the most from the car, or as close to the most as they can. And that's the key thing that I think Vasseur understands better than most people.
Yeah, and what Leclerc always says about Vasseur is the amount of clarity in terms of objectives and direction that he brings to all aspects of the team. And he usually says it in terms of the technical direction, but I'm sure he also means it gives clarity to him in terms of Leclerc, what he needs to do. And I detect very much Vasseur's hand in the change of race engineer as well.
And when we've talked about, Leclerc's improvements, they're so much linked to that Ferrari improving in terms of drivability. So I think that's why we've also seen far fewer mistakes, is because, like you say, they've listened to the drivers and they've made a much more drivable car. And you have to have that in a championship battle, because it's all well and good having a fast car, but obviously if there's going to be mistakes at those high pressure moments influenced by a car that's tricky to drive, that's not going to help. So they've just built such a good platform for both drivers, and particularly for Leclerc.
We've talked about hypothetical title bids, Josh, but considering what we've been talking about with Leclerc, how likely is it, do you think, that Ferrari and Leclerc could become genuine title contenders this year?
Becoming more and more likely with every weekend, especially a weekend like Monaco. 31 points isn't a huge gap in the championship. That's only going to take a nightmare Montreal weekend for Red Bull, and suddenly there's single digits between them. But you'd have to say Verstappen's still overwhelmingly the favourite, and it's still, I think, in favour of there being no title fight this year. But there's a good chance that they could still push them. Fundamentally, Red Bull isn't going to cure the weakness that cost them so dearly in Monaco. It will just be a case of how much is that going to cost them for the rest of the year, and that's probably really the crucial thing. We know Ferrari is going to have a race-winning car at certain rounds, but I think it's more going to depend on how much trouble is Red Bull going to be in over the next few rounds, and their kind of weak spots. I think they've shown they're capable of taking advantage, but obviously you've got the McLaren variable to throw in there as well, which probably doesn't help. It would certainly help Leclerc and Ferrari a bit more, I think, if they were the kind of main spearhead against Red Bull and Verstappen.
Yeah, I think the McLaren aspect is important, because you've got a third team in the mix that is going to take points off of Ferrari on certain weekends. That's
because it could take points off Red Bull. It kind of goes both ways, isn't it? But it all depends how the weekend shakes out a bit.
It's difficult to see Red Bull dropping to third best, though, on all but the most extreme outlier weekends at the moment. So by default, you would think it's and at the moment it's a battle between Ferrari and McLaren to be second best, and they're therefore the one that can snipe if Max and Red Bull run into trouble. The ray of light for everyone is that Red Bull do appear to be hitting that kind of upper limit of development potentially. Christian Horner's talked relentlessly about diminishing returns, and eventually we're going to see that. And you thought, well, maybe, but you're so far ahead. You've got all this pent-up development from 2023 that you didn't need to use, and you've thrown it into 2024. You're just going to be down the road, and you just keep rolling that advantage through the years. Maybe it's not the case. They bought updates this year. Obviously, they've improved the car, but they're now into that challenge that almost every team has, where it's needing to be rebalanced, and they're finding it tricky. And it does seem like McLaren especially, but McLaren and Ferrari are kind of developing them in terms of the rate at the moment. And if that can continue through this year, I didn't think we'd see it until 25, when I kind of thought, Ferrari are going to throw everything at that year. Lewis comes into the team. Can we nick the last championship before the rules change? A bit like Red Bull did to Mercedes before ground effect. But it seems like we're slightly ahead of that curve. McLaren haven't disappointed, even though they came into the season maybe a little bit undercooked. And Red Bull haven't just taken the same step further ahead. They're suddenly into this patch of consistently every weekend struggling to get the car to work. Max not able to do things that he wants. The curb riding, which he says has always been a problem, now is suddenly rearing its head as a major problem at Monaco, when you would have, before the weekend thought, he'll be fine at Monaco, really. Maybe the front tyre warm-up be a thing in qualifying, but he's able to get round it. So if the development war continues to go in favour of those other teams, they could genuinely get to the point where it's a proper fight, and then it will be a case of whether Red Bull has banked enough points in the early part of the season to kind of hold that off. You'd have to say Max has done a pretty good job of that so far, but there's a hell of a long way to go.
Yeah, Red Bull didn't completely steamroll those early races, did they? Because of the kind of Melbourne outlier, which at the time people probably thought, well, that's not going to make much difference to the title fight. But actually that right now is the thing that's keeping them in it. I've compared the season to 2019 a couple of times, and you remember then Mercedes just absolutely romped that early part of the season, so the title fight wasn't a factor even when the other teams were a bit more in the fight. The difference now is that because of the good season that Leclerc and Ferrari have had, they're within not too bad a range, to the point where if they can have more weekends like we've seen, then it's not absolutely impossible in a way that without Melbourne going wrong for Red Bull, it would suddenly be, up to 50, 60 points.
It's another boon for Vasseur, isn't it? Because he's talked endlessly about having the raceable car, the car that can score the points. Even if it's not going to be a winning weekend, the maximum points you can. They didn't have that last year, but this year they have. So even the weekends where they're a little bit disappointing or off it, they're sniping for the podium. They're always kind of in that top 4 group, and that's the key through the season if they're gonna have a chance of beating Red Bull, especially when the second car is so up and down.
Well, yeah, that's the constructors' kind of point. I think there's way more of a case, isn't there, for a constructors fight been on this year with the Sainz Leclerc lineup there. Obviously, you compare that to Verstappen and Perez, and there's going to be, I think, far fewer missed opportunities at Ferrari. So I think that the constructors fight is absolutely on.
And Perez also, that we'll see if it's just a collection of unfortunate circumstances, but the fact that Red Bull's starting to push on with the car and Perez is suddenly dropping his performance again, like that's the other thing that makes me feel like that for the first time maybe Red Bull was slightly losing their way. It looked like the start of the season he was so much closer. You feel like, oh yeah, they've got a complete handle on this. The car's so easy, or so much easier than it has been, that Perez has taken this big step. But that's, that narrative has totally shifted around, and that really gives you a kind of a glimmer of hope for everyone, not just the teams obviously chasing at the moment. It'd be great if this could turn into a proper fight.
Well, there's 16 races left. I'd still expect Red Bull to win a pretty hefty number of them at current rates. They could easily win 10 of them. So I suspect that, Drivers' Championship will be fine. Yeah, there's that question mark in the Constructors' Championship. But considering where we were early in the season, expecting another complete walkover, the fact that there's a debate to be had is very positive for the convergence at the front in Formula One. Right, Ben, let's look at the really longer-term picture for Ferrari, because on the horizon, Lewis Hamilton's coming into Ferrari. Do you think that'll potentially be a career-defining matchup for Leclerc?
The super team. So this is a tough one because, yes, having a guy of Lewis's track record to go up against, this is kind of another beast for Leclerc to slay, I suppose. This is the most decorated driver he'll have gone up against since Vettel, who he did effectively end the F1 career of, I think, by getting the better of him. I don't think Vettel was or is quite on the level of a Lewis Hamilton. Lewis Hamilton at his best. I'm not sure, though, in saying that we're seeing the absolute best of Lewis Hamilton anymore. He talked about the self-doubt he was racked with last year. Doesn't seem like he's absolutely on it this year, but the mitigating circumstances are so obvious in terms of Mercedes being lost and then this year being kind of that dead rubber before he moves on to pastures new. So if we get to see Lewis at his best, kind of Hungary 2023 qualifying spec Lewis Hamilton, then that's going to be a major test. And if Leclerc can beat Hamilton, then that ends any question, doesn't it, of whether he is top tier and kind of ready for the title fight that we've been talking about. If he gets beaten by Lewis, that's bad news, obviously. But at the same time, people might say, well, you'd expect that because of Lewis Hamilton's record and the fact he's one of the best and most decorated drivers ever. So you end up potentially in a kind of high-resolution version of the Ricciardo Tsunoda argument, where you're kind of damned if you do and damned if you don't. If Leclerc beats Hamilton, people will say, oh, Hamilton's washed up now, so big whoop. And if Hamilton beats Leclerc, it's bad news for any driver who's being beaten, obviously, but people will say, well, we expect that because it's Lewis Hamilton. He's a 7-time world champion. Of course he should beat Charles Leclerc. So, yeah, a tricky one. Could it be tricky for Ferrari to manage? Maybe. But nevertheless, I would say having a Lewis Hamilton driving at his best is an upgrade on Carlos Sainz. So you should see Ferrari, if the car is good again, moving forward. And I also would think that it's a good way of Ferrari testing Leclerc, because having a teammate that you've got to think about is obviously an important way of getting a driver to dig deeper and find even more performance.
I think we'll need to wait for the picture to emerge a bit as well. I could very much see a scenario where at the start of 25, Leclerc has a clear Edge and Hamilton's maybe struggling over one lap in that car. I mean, he's had struggles at Mercedes, and obviously he's been there for years, especially at the start of the season. He can sometimes be a bit sluggish. So throw in a whole new team and car, but I wouldn't be surprised if that's the case. So I think people will be quick to make judgments either way, but I think we have to kind of let that whole season play out at least. But Ed,
the qualifying record against Russell's got to be a concern, though, hasn't it? Now?
Yeah, going against Leclerc as well, it's going to be a real challenge over one lap. I could see a scenario where, Leclerc has that one lap edge and maybe they're a bit closer in the race. That feels like the most likely scenario. But then I was looking back at his qualifying results in 21 and quite surprised about how good over one lap Lewis was then, because it's so easy to forget out of the past couple of years. So like you said, will that circumstance change if he's back in a championship race winning car? I think he's got to go up a level. It's just how much is that step going to be, and is that going to get him onto terms with Leclerc?
I can see quite an energised Hamilton if he's happy with the car at the start of next season. He's going to be quick. I don't think he's suddenly massively declined. I think
he's not Kimi Räikkönen, is he?
Yeah, exactly. I think as Mark Hughes said in a recent podcast, George Russell is a hell of a driver. He's very quick, and having a bit of a battle with him in qualifying, even though he's been out-qualified 7 times so far this year, so he is losing that qualifying battle. The gaps have been quite tight, so the average gap is very, very small as well, which it has been over the previous couple of seasons together. So it's really interesting. It could be a handy finishing school for Leclerc as well, because like I said, I see some parallels in terms of the evolution of those two drivers, and it'd be a good chance to benchmark himself in terms of tyre management, because Hamilton's brilliant on tyre management and the way he approaches his weekend, so that could be extremely helpful for Leclerc. But at the same time, you could also argue it's a slightly unexpected situation for Leclerc, because what is he? He's going to be 27 at the start of next season. He's made Ferrari his own, and then he's suddenly got this unexpected challenge. So I actually find it really, really hard to predict, especially because they're both drivers, although they're not identical stylistically in terms of what they need from the car. It's not particularly vastly different. So I don't see one being monstrously contained by the characteristics of the car and the other thriving. So it's a really, really interesting battle, and I think that's the tantalising thing. We just don't know how that one's going to go.
And Ed, you said in the question, is it going to be career-defining for Leclerc? But I think this is career-defining for Hamilton too. Nothing that happens there is going to take away any of his success, but inevitably you're going to see some kind of imprint for the future there. If you look at Vettel's career, obviously everybody remembers the end just as much as the kind of glory years. People always point to those Ferrari years where Leclerc was able to wrestle control. I think on Bring Back V10s, Alain Prost, his 93 season is mentioned maybe more than any of his others, and that was right at the end. So I think it could be a similar thing here for Lewis, depending on how it goes. And he'll have to kind of be bringing his A game, because we've seen the level that Leclerc's at now. It's certainly going to be no kind of, I think, easy challenge for him to walk in there and basically wrestle away a team that Leclerc has built up over all these last few years.
As Lewis has said, he can only lose now, really, can't he? Because he's got this enormous track record, this huge success.
Oh, no. Another title with Ferrari, surely. Displanting Leclerc, that would be a great flourish, surely, for the end of the career.
Yeah, if it goes well. But in his mind, it's like, whatever he does, he there's no get out of jail free card for Lewis. He has to perform, because if he doesn't, then it's like, well, you're just washed up. You're not what you were. You're out. And if he wins, well, it's expected, because he's won so much before and is so successful and considered so good. So if he's made peace with that, he's talked about this himself. If he's made peace with that kind of situation, then it's kind of like a free hit for him, really, isn't it? Because Mercedes just haven't made the progress they need to. You can see the progress Ferrari are making under management that Leclerc trusts, and Hamilton will implicitly trust as well, because he's seen this, firsthand. So Hamilton can go in, like Ed said, kind of breezy at the start of next year, completely refreshed, new opportunity. There will be that element. There's always that technical element of not quite having everything lined up for you in a new team. He had it at Merck, didn't he, Ed? I think there was that first season where Hamilton wasn't totally comfortable in the car. There's certain things about seating position and how you work with the team, processes and stuff. They won't come automatically. That will be to Leclerc's advantage. But by 2026, when the rules change, the cars change, the engines change, Hamilton should have kind of everything settled on that score. And then probably that year you'll see the full, true-blooded, equal battle between the two.
Yeah, I think that's why it's important that Leclerc has this run with making progress in terms of getting things a little bit more calm and working properly within Ferrari, because one of the great weapons he's got up against Hamilton is incumbency. He's been at Ferrari since 2019 as a race driver, so he knows it inside out. He will have all that data bank and knowledge of all the subtleties going on, and Hamilton
knows where the good coffee is.
Exactly, and Hamilton will be jumping into, even simple things like Hamilton's always had Mercedes engines in Formula One, so there's things that will be, in terms of the way the Ferrari engines work, by which I often mean settings and all those little subtleties, the tools, all these things take a little bit of time. So if you're Leclerc, you're probably thinking, not only am I going to back myself to be quicker, and make no mistake, both Hamilton and Leclerc will expect to be the quicker driver, will expect to establish themselves as the number one next year. That's just how the minds will work. But Leclerc has quite a few advantages in his armoury, which I just think it makes it such a fascinating battle. There are those who just think Hamilton's not going to be at his level, and I don't think that's going to be how it plays out. I think it could be I think it could be a very close and interesting battle, but it's really hard.
Let's hope so.
It's really hard to predict how it'll work out. Really, really difficult, which I think is fantastic, because this is just a question we can keep asking and asking and asking ahead of next year, because it's endlessly tantalising.
It's great that Lewis has done it, to take this punt at the end of his career, rather than just do what we thought was going to be the pathway and just see it out with Mercedes for as long as possible and then become the ambassador, blah, blah, blah. I think it's great that he's kind of backed himself to go into, a team that has built itself around one of the fastest drivers we've seen in recent years, and, back himself to get the job done as well.
Yeah, he's not taken the safe route, I think, for the end of his career at all. But, one thing, I think it's just been so unprecedented in history to get a scenario like this. I was trying to think of a comparison, and there just really isn't one, to have a driver who hasn't won a title yet but has sort of built himself up to be on the verge of one, and then for a world champion to jump in alongside him. I guess it would be like, Verstappen in 21 suddenly having a Fernando Alonso alongside him or something like that. It's just so kind of unprecedented and a wild scenario that I think that's what makes it so hard to predict what's going to happen, and it may well be just one of those things that is very much, I think, of a one of a kind for quite a while. Yeah,
if you're looking for analogies, almost the closest was when Lauda came back at McLaren, and then Prost came in, obviously a slightly different.
That's a good shout.
Slightly different order. The age gap wasn't as big because it was only about 6 years between Prost and Lauda, but Lauda was a driver from an earlier generation, very much at that stage, and that was an interesting battle because obviously Lauda won it in '84 to win the championship, and then his form kind of fell off a cliff in '85. Only won one Grand Prix, and on Prost went. So, it's not identical, but that's one that feels a little bit like that. But that's what makes it so interesting. I didn't think Hamilton would do this. I think it's great he is doing it. It's going to be so interesting. And I think the very fact he's been willing to do it means it's more likely to be a success, if you see what I mean. Because it wasn't kind of a shruggy, I might as well. I think there's
he's not just extending his career for the sake of it, is it? Like the Kimi Räikkönen years felt mercenary almost, but this doesn't feel like that. This feels like I've been held back for a few years now. I've had enough. I've got more to give. I can win the 8th, and this is my best shot at doing it.
And I think that means he'll leave nothing on the table. But as for how it'll end up, it's so hard to tell. I suspect there will be weekends where one's quicker and weekends when the other's quicker, which is not that bold a prediction. But
will they collide? Will it just blow up in Fred's face?
Yeah, I don't really see it going there. I think Vasseurs quite good at controlling that sort of thing, and actually I think those two drivers are quite good at it. But again, it's how the personalities mesh and how they conduct themselves, and different drivers who see themselves as the number one have a very clear idea of how things should work in a team, and both of them will see themselves as the number one.
100%.
And that is a potential point of friction. I don't think either of them are natural troublemakers, if you want to put it that way, but their presence can create trouble. They're sharing the same space can, just through the way these things work.
And they've always got on well off track, and on track they've never really had a huge amount of skirmishes, or if they have, they've kind of got over it quite quickly. But obviously when you become teammates, I think all that kind of goes out the window in a certain respect, because you're never quite sure how they're actually going to interact when they're having to work together, obviously, to make sure that Ferrari can challenge Red Bull in 25, and also going into 26, which again is going to be another reset, because however it plays out in 25 could be different from how it then starts in 26 with a whole new car and engine.
there could be an element also of elder statesman at play. Lewis being at that different phase of his career, slightly more mellow, or at least with a greater sense of the bigger picture than he might have had when he was at Leclerc's stage. We talked about Leclerc destroying Vettel at Ferrari and beating him quite badly, and they had some on-track incidents too, but it didn't stop Vettel ultimately leaving the team saying, well, good luck, Charles, you're the most talented guy I've ever come up against. So I think fundamentally, however it goes, Lewis will, in a way he wouldn't have done perhaps during the early Mercedes years alongside Rosberg, I think he'll have a sense of, if he loses, fair enough, I've been beaten by a better man. I don't think he'll go into Ferrari thinking that will happen, but I think he would probably at this stage of his career have the good grace to accept if it did happen.
And I think whatever happens, I don't think it's going to be a Leclerc versus Vettel style trajectory.
No.
Because Leclerc did pretty much crush Vettel, ultimately.
Yeah, he did, yeah.
And obviously, as we've spoken about before, Vettel has a certain narrowness of operating window that makes him spectacularly good in certain conditions, but at that time he wasn't at his best for various reasons. And I don't see Hamilton being in anything like that sort of situation. He's a much broader driver.
And to throw in just one final curveball, you probably have Ollie Behrman on the grid at Haas next year, obviously Ferrari youngster, and somebody that Ferrari will have to make room for at some point if Behrman performs as we expect he probably will in F1. Obviously, if either Hamilton or Leclerc don't perform, there's an option there to advance things. But then obviously if they do perform, it's a question of what do they do with Behrman. But then that's probably quite a good problem to have, I think, if you've got three drivers who are performing very well.
Yeah, it's better than the opposite end of the scale if you've only got one driver who's really delivering the goods, as a few teams have been suffering from. But yeah, that's going to be a great storyline. And the reason we've talked about it here is I think we have to see this season for Leclerc in terms of setting himself up for next year as well, because that's going to be a big battle, whatever happens. And it's looking like the Ferrari next year on current trajectory could well be a title contender on merit, even if this year it doesn't quite come to pass. Well, thanks Ben and Josh for your insight into therace.com. Plenty to read there. Loads of other podcasts to listen to. Bring Back V10s, which tells classic F1 stories, is ramping up for a new season. And also our IndyCar podcast, our tech podcast with the excellent Gary Andersonn, MotoGP, IndyCar and Formula E podcasts as well. And also have a look at our YouTube channel. And also, if you feel so inclined and you would like to give us a review of this podcast on whatever platform you use, that would be much appreciated, as that very much does help it in terms of the podcast being discoverable for others. Right, well, we're looking towards Canada now, so stay with us for everything you need to know from the world of Formula One.
The Athletic.